Picture this. You're a Saskatchewan farmer who just spent months carefully nurturing a canola crop, watching it grow golden under the prairie sun, harvesting it with precision, and then China decides your product now costs double what it did yesterday because of a political spat over electric vehicles you've never even seen. Welcome to the absolutely wild world of international trade, where your livelihood can become collateral damage in a geopolitical chess match between Ottawa and Beijing. And now, in what might be the most important diplomatic road trip since your parents drove across the country to find themselves in the 70s, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe are heading to China together to try and fix this mess. Canola farmers across the prairies are glued to their phones, refreshing news feeds like they're waiting for concert tickets to drop, hoping that this trip actually delivers results instead of just fancy photo ops and vague promises about recalibrating relationships. So buckle up, because we're diving into why Saskatchewan's agricultural future might depend on what happens in meeting rooms halfway around the world, and why farmers are cautiously optimistic that someone in government finally remembered they exist. Let's set the scene, because context matters when you're talking about tariffs that could bankrupt family farms. Last March, China decided to slap a 100% tariff on Canadian canola products. Not 10%. Not 25%. 100%. That's basically telling Canadian farmers we're doubling your prices, good luck competing with literally anyone else. They also threw tariffs on pork and seafood for good measure, because apparently when China decides to make a point, they don't believe in half measures. And what prompted this economic sledgehammer? Canadian tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles from 2024. That's right, folks. Saskatchewan farmers are paying the price for a trade dispute about EVs, which is like getting grounded because your sibling broke curfew. The connection makes sense in the twisted logic of international trade retaliation, but it doesn't make it any less infuriating for the farmers caught in the crossfire. Bill Prybylski, president of the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan, basically summed up what every farmer in the province is thinking when he said it's about time the federal government took some action. And honestly, can you blame the frustration? Imagine running a business where your biggest customer suddenly doubles your prices overnight, your revenues tank, you're staring at bills you can't pay, and the government response is essentially radio silence for months. It's like calling tech support and being put on hold for so long you forget what problem you were calling about in the first place, except instead of a computer glitch, it's your entire livelihood on the line. Now, Carney and Moe are heading to China on what's being described as a trip to recalibrate Canada's relationship with the Chinese government. Recalibrate is such a beautifully diplomatic word, isn't it? It's the political equivalent of we need to talk. Could mean anything from let's fix this minor misunderstanding to our entire relationship is broken and we need to rebuild from scratch. Carney's parliamentary secretary says they're looking at economic opportunities for both nations, which sounds promising, but farmers have learned to be skeptical when politicians talk about opportunities without mentioning specific solutions to current problems. What makes this trip particularly interesting is the tag team approach. You've got the Prime Minister and a provincial premier traveling together, which doesn't happen every day. It's like Batman and Robin teaming up, except instead of fighting crime, they're fighting tariffs, and instead of a Batmobile, they're probably flying commercial. Moe's presence on this trip is crucial because Saskatchewan isn't just any province when it comes to canola, it's the heart of Canadian canola production. When China puts tariffs on canola, Saskatchewan farmers feel it first and hardest. Having Moe there sends a message that this isn't just federal government business as usual, this is urgent, provincial-level concern that demands attention. But let's talk about what these tariffs actually mean on the ground, because numbers are one thing but real-world impact is another. A 100% tariff doesn't just mean Chinese buyers pay more, it means Canadian canola becomes completely uncompetitive in the Chinese market. Other countries who don't have these tariffs can undercut Canadian prices by massive margins. So Chinese buyers simply stop buying Canadian canola and buy from elsewhere. That means Saskatchewan farmers who've been selling to China for years suddenly have no market for their product. They've got canola they can't sell at fair prices, bills they can't pay, and equipment they've invested in that's now potentially sitting idle or underutilized. It's not a minor inconvenience, for some farmers, it's an existential threat. And here's the kicker that makes this whole situation even more absurd. The tariffs that triggered China's response were on electric vehicles. Canadian farmers had absolutely nothing to do with that decision. They weren't consulted. They didn't lobby for those tariffs. They probably don't even have strong opinions about Chinese EV imports. But when international trade disputes happen, it's rarely the decision makers who pay the price, it's the people in industries that make convenient targets for retaliation. China chose canola, pork, and seafood because they knew it would hurt Canadian producers and create political pressure on the Canadian government. It's economic warfare by proxy, and Saskatchewan farmers are the collateral damage. So what are Carney and Moe actually hoping to accomplish in China? The official line is recalibrating relationships and exploring economic opportunities, but reading between the lines, they need to convince China to drop or at least reduce these tariffs. That's easier said than done. China doesn't just slap on tariffs as a temporary measure, they use trade as a political tool, and they're very good at it. They've done this before with Australian wine, Norwegian salmon, and Lithuanian goods. When China wants to make a political point, economic pain is their language of choice. Convincing them to reverse course requires offering something they want in return, whether that's policy changes, economic concessions, or diplomatic positioning on other issues. The challenge Carney faces is threading an incredibly narrow needle. On one hand, he needs to secure relief for Canadian farmers who are genuinely struggling. On the other hand, he can't be seen as caving to Chinese pressure or backing down from legitimate Canadian policy positions. If he reverses the EV tariffs just because China retaliated, that sets a dangerous precedent where any Canadian trade policy can be held hostage by the threat of Chinese retaliation. But if he holds firm on principle while farmers go bankrupt, that's not exactly great politics either, especially in prairie provinces where agriculture is king and memories are long. Moe's role in this is fascinating because provincial premiers don't usually get involved in federal foreign policy, but when your province's economy is on the line, traditional boundaries start to blur. Moe has been vocal about the need for federal action on this issue, and his presence in China is both practical and symbolic. Practical because he can speak directly to the impact on Saskatchewan's economy and farming communities in ways that carry weight. Symbolic because it shows Beijing that this isn't just some federal government initiative that provincial leaders are lukewarm about. There's unified Canadian concern about these tariffs spanning multiple levels of government. Saskatchewan farmers, meanwhile, are watching all of this with a mixture of hope and skepticism that's probably familiar to anyone who's ever waited for a politician to deliver on a promise. They want to believe this trip will make a difference. They desperately need it to make a difference. But they've been around long enough to know that diplomatic trips don't always produce tangible results, and even when they do, those results take time to materialize. A farmer facing bills today can't wait 6 months for a trade agreement to maybe get negotiated and possibly reduce tariffs eventually. The economics of farming don't allow for that kind of uncertainty. What makes this situation particularly frustrating is that Canadian canola is genuinely high-quality product that Chinese buyers want. This isn't a case where Canadian goods are being rejected because they're inferior or overpriced under normal market conditions. Before the tariffs, Canadian canola was competitive and sought after in China. The problem is purely political, which means the solution needs to be political too. But politics moves slowly, and agricultural economics move fast. That mismatch between the speed of political solutions and the urgency of economic reality is what keeps farmers up at night. There's also the bigger picture here about Canada's relationship with China, which has been rocky for years now. The Meng Wanzhou affair, the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, concerns about Chinese interference in Canadian affairs, disagreements on human rights issues. The relationship between Ottawa and Beijing has more baggage than a cross-country flight. This trip is about more than just canola tariffs. It's about whether Canada and China can find a way to have a functional economic relationship despite having fundamental disagreements on other issues. That's complicated diplomacy, and there are no easy answers. For Saskatchewan farmers, though, the calculation is simpler. They need markets for their canola. They need fair access to buyers. They need the tariffs gone or at least reduced to manageable levels. Everything else is secondary. And they're hoping that when Carney and Moe sit across from Chinese officials in those meeting rooms, someone makes the case clearly and forcefully that Saskatchewan farmers shouldn't be paying the price for unrelated trade disputes. Whether that message will be heard and whether it will produce results remains to be seen. So here we are, watching a Prime Minister and a Premier head to China on a mission that could determine whether Saskatchewan farmers have viable markets for their crops or whether they are stuck absorbing massive economic losses through no fault of their own. It's international trade at its most personal, where decisions made in government offices translate directly into whether family farms survive or fold. Farmers across the prairies are keeping their fingers crossed, but they're also keeping their expectations realistic, because they've learned that in agriculture, hope for the best but plan for the worst is more than a saying, it's survival strategy. Will Carney and Moe come back from China with a deal that helps Saskatchewan farmers, or will this be another diplomatic trip heavy on symbolism but light on substance? We're about to find out, and you can bet we'll be covering every development because when prairie farmers are on edge, Canadian Insights is paying attention. If you want to stay updated on whether this China trip delivers actual results or just photo ops and platitudes, smash that subscribe button because we're pumping out multiple videos daily covering every angle of Canadian politics. Hit like if you think Saskatchewan farmers deserve better than being collateral damage in trade wars they didn't start, and drop a comment telling us what you think Carney needs to accomplish in China to make this trip worthwhile. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that behind every trade statistic is a real person trying to make a living.